Hi again, everyone, and welcome back to the next Are We Living in the Last Days podcast. We thank you for your continued support and prayers. In the next series of podcasts, beginning with this one, we're going to be exploring the world as it was in the days of Noah, focusing on the sometimes misunderstood Nephilim. Who or what were they? And before I turn it over to Kevin, I hope you stay tuned for all three parts of this series. We're truly excited to share today's information with you. I feel confident that we are going to present to you many things that you did not know. Kevin, take it away.
Yeah, that's right, Kevin. I mean, we got a really interesting one for you today. So let's dive right in. Jesus tells us in Matthew 24, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be." We have just been given a wealth of information here. Remember also, we're told in Proverbs, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter." Jesus is telling us that in the day and age we are living in, people are going to be going about their normal life, and then the rapture will happen, Noah entering the ark. And then tribulation will come, the flood. I believe we're also given some insight into the rapture and that people are going to be living their daily lives, and then the rapture happens. And as we look at the calamities that are lining up and are about to unfold, it's kind of hard to see how people will be living their daily lives through it. But that's a topic for another podcast. The part I want to focus on here is that we are also being told that at the second advent, the physical return of Jesus, it will be like it was in the days of Noah. Keep in mind that after the rapture, there will be some gap of time before the treaty between the Antichrist and Israel is signed, which starts tribulation. There will then be 7 years from that point until the point that Jesus will return to earth. Now, we have no idea how long the gap of time between the rapture and tribulation will be. Point being, we know there will be an additional 7 years from now until that treaty is signed. And if we are seeing the shadows being cast by coming events now, then we know we are close, closer than we truly realize. Before we jump into this, there are two things I want to point out. First, the Bible is the source of truth, and anything that contradicts the Bible is not a usable source or reference for the truth. We will be referencing the book of Enoch in this series. I know many of you already know about the book of Enoch, but if you don't, the book of Enoch is considered a value reference by many biblical teachers. Much like how we consider the writings of Josephus, who was a historian at the time of Jesus, both his writings in the book of Enoch do not contradict the Bible, but rather points to its validity. The book of Enoch was revered by early church fathers and is even referenced in the book of Jude, chapter 1, verses 14 through 15, and there are other places in the Bible that are believed to be references to the book of Enoch. It was also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that being said, we will be referencing the book of Enoch, but not in lieu of or as on par with the Bible, but rather much like we would reference a historical document from Josephus. As a side note, if you decide to look into the book of Enoch, do not be confused by the second or third book of Enoch. They were written by a rabbi who claimed to have had a vision and are not really a part of the book of Enoch. I believe those were written sometime shortly before Jesus. The second thing I would like to point out is, we're going to be covering topics that some or many have already widely been covered. Much of that coverage tends to be more of the 10,000-foot view of the information. I hate to use this analogy because it sounds a little pretentious, but it is the best way to convey the idea, which is, this isn't going to be an Intro 101 type class. This is going to be a senior level class that will make assumptions and move at a fast pace through a lot of material. Again, I'm not so arrogant as to believe we're somehow giving you a class. It's merely a metaphor. I also know many of you, if not all of you, will most likely at times be saying, "I thought you weren't going to waste time on the intro stuff." While we may talk about it, we're not going to take time to go into the original Greek and cross-references and so on to verify points you've already seen and done that with. So we'll start with the 10,000-foot view, but we'll do our best to get as close to ground level with it as we can. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to imply that this is some kind of advanced trigonometry that you have had to have at least gone through geometry to have a chance to understand. The point I'm trying to make is a newly minted Christian or someone who hasn't spent time delving into the mysteries of God are first met with the fact that Nephilim existed and the implications of that. However, it is merely scratching the surface, and if you haven't already wrapped your mind around it by continuing on in the Word of God, then going deeper with something like this can be very tough and you might not get much out of it. You could also find yourself on shaky ground because you haven't spent time in the Word that you should have. So with that understanding, let's dive in. Jesus tells us that at the point of the second advent, it will be like the antediluvian world. More to the point, it will be like it was right before he sent the flood. As you know, we are being told a lot there. In fact, we've just been given a mountain of information to investigate, and the deeper you dig, the more fascinating it becomes. So at the tip of this proverbial mountain, we'll start with Genesis chapter 6. Verses 1 through 4 takes us from the start of the fallen angels up into where God decides to send the flood. And verses 5 through 12 gives us more insight as to why God decided to send the flood and why Noah was chosen and spared. Let's start with verses 1 through 4 and look at the antediluvian world. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and bore children to them, those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. If you're like me, in times past, I've envisioned the antediluvian world. I've pictured in my mind a sparsely populated agricultural society with Nephilim roaming around. Somewhat like taking people of Jesus' age and putting them in a Jurassic-type terrain. If that's the vision or somewhat close to the vision you've had in your mind's eye, that vision is so far off the mark it is wildly wrong. The truth is the exact opposite. 2 Peter 3:6 refers to it as the world that perished in the flood. There were 2,256 years from Adam to the flood. If the birth rate was half the modern birth rate, now mind you, half, and if the mortality rate was double, not the same, but double the modern mortality rate, at the time of the flood, there would have been a minimum of 7 billion people in this world. Keep in mind, this number comes from saying double the mortality rate and half the birth rate, and also is not taking into account the long lives that people had lived then. In reality, at the time of the flood, there were a lot more than that. In this world, there are currently 7.6 billion people. That world was fully populated, made up of nations and civilizations that were exceedingly advanced. I'm going to play a few clips for you from Jimmy Corsetti, a well-known content creator and archaeological investigator. Now, he comes from a completely secular standpoint. He's not biblical at all. But watching him, it's not at all hard to see how he's right at the truth, but he isn't quite getting there because he's not coming at it with a biblical knowledge of what he is seeing.
Ancient human civilization was far older and far more advanced than we were ever taught in school. In fact, we were a global civilization that spanned multiple continents around the world. And in this video, I'm going to show you key evidence ranging from South America, the Mideast, Southeast Asia, and when you connect it all, it far exceeds the realm of just a coincidence. Now, real quick, let me get the big question out of the way that most people have when they hear this information for the first time, which is, okay, if we were so advanced, what happened to us? Or where's the evidence like metal buildings? Well, you must first take into consideration that there was a massive global cataclysm that happened 13,000 years ago. And as far as metal buildings, we must take into consideration just how long of a period of time 13,000 years ago is. I mean, we hear figures like, okay, the dinosaurs apparently went extinct 66 million years ago. So when we hear figures like 13,000 years ago, most of us think, okay, well, that's not that long ago. But take, for example, the Titanic, which in just a couple days will have been at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean for 105 years. Nearly 50,000 tons of steel and iron is just disintegrated. And in just a few hundred more years, it will be as if it never existed in the first place. Take even cars as an example. If you leave them outside for just a few decades, they rust straight through and completely just get immersed into the earth, and within a few hundred years, they're non-existent as well. Or even houses. If you don't restore a house within a few decades, the roof will cave in, the walls will cave in, and the same thing happens to it as well. So just imagine what could happen over a period of 1,000 years, or 5,000 years, or even 10 or 13,000 years ago. Quite literally, the only thing that survives that long period of time is stone. Now let's dive right into the evidence. There are two lines that connect several ancient civilizations and megalithic structures ranging from Easter Island to Machu Picchu in Peru, which is right by the Nazca lines, as well as Cusco and Sacsayhuaman, which is so mysterious in how these walls were built and how these megalithic stones were constructed. And when you connect the line from Easter Island, which is so mysterious, to Peru, all the way across the Atlantic to Mali, Africa, which is the location of the Dogon people, if I pronounce that correctly, which for some reason in ancient times they were aware of star Sirius B. which is invisible to the naked eye, and it's not something that was apparently discovered for thousands of years later, yet somehow they have legends and tales of it. And this also coincides with the Sumerians, allegedly the birthplace of civilization in Mesopotamia, that they somehow were aware of the planets within our own solar system. They knew that the Earth was bigger than Mars, and that Jupiter was bigger than Saturn, and Saturn bigger than Uranus, and so on. And yet these planets were not supposed to have been discovered for thousands of years later, but they somehow knew about it and etched it in stone and on clay tablets that were discovered thousands of years later. It's a total mystery. Now, when you connect the line straight through the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx, all the way through to Jordan, where Petra is located, the underground city of Petra, which is so mysterious in of itself. It could hold more than 20,000 people. No one knows who built it or when. And even just a year ago, they found an entirely new entrance with incredible architecture more than 160 feet high. And when you connect a line through Petra, it goes over to the Persepolis in Iran, which is mysterious in of itself, and there's many theories on who built it and when. However, when you consider other ancient civilizations and megalithic structures, we find an entirely other new line that goes from Mesopotamia in where is apparently the birthplace of Muhammad and was just a key site in the Sumerian culture. And if you connect that line over to Pakistan, to the ancient civilization of Mohenjo-Daro, and when you continue that line over to Southeast Asia, running through ancient sites in Burma, all the way over to Cambodia, which is the famous site of Angkor Wat, which is very mysterious. It's a site of much speculation and debate. But ultimately, there are two lines that intersect. And these lines, I mean, really, is it just a coincidence that all of these megalithic sites just happen to be completely connected along two lines? Is it possible that it's not a coincidence? Well, when you tie in other key pieces of evidence ranging from South America to Egypt to Southeast Asia, you see that, oh my goodness, there are incredible similarities between architecture, stone structures, whether it's the similarities of pyramids, or even the use of obelisks, or the use of trapezoidal doors, which I've never seen before, but they just so happen to be located and found in ancient Egypt, as well as the Incan culture in Peru. Or even take the example of gold funeral masks that were utilized by the Incans and the Egyptians as well. And it doesn't stop there. Just when you consider how they were able to cut and carve these massive stones and place them, and yet they share similarities across multiple continents around the world, you have to start asking questions. They even have similarities between the depiction of the third eye, as well as animals that's located at the center of foreheads. And like I said, when you consider the similarities between architecture and stone structures and buildings across multiple continents, when you look at these similarities, you have to ask yourself, were they built by the same people? I mean, after all, when you consider these incredible lines that connect megalithic structures and ancient civilizations that are so mysterious in of themselves, when you consider the incredible similarities between cultures, stone structures, and stone buildings, it's abundantly clear that there was a global civilization that existed, and we were wiped out back to the Stone Age approximately 13,000 years ago, and yet the mainstream scientists and archaeologists and historians, no one wants to touch on the subject of the cataclysm. But when you start connecting the dots on how they were able to cut and carve stones that even modern-day stonemasons completely disagree with, and when you look at how, well, okay, the primitive methods that have been suggested by archaeologists and Egyptologists don't compute because of the tens of millions of stone blocks, statues, and structures found just in Egypt alone, could not have been done with those primitive methods anywhere within the realm of time. In fact, they'd still be working on them today. So something doesn't add up. We are absolutely far older, and we're far more advanced than the textbooks are currently teaching everyone in school.
The antediluvian world was a global population. This population was exceptionally advanced, and yes, as hard as it may be to believe, they were more advanced, far more advanced, than we are now. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, 'See, this is new'? It has already been done in ancient times before us." Keep that in mind. We'll be mentioning that again. We know from the book of Enoch, fallen angels, the Watchers, descended on humanity during the time of Jared, which was 960 years after Adam and 1,296 years before the flood. We are given a great deal of detail of these Watchers. For instance, we are told that the Watchers are divided into groups of 10, and each group has a leader, and we're given the names of these leaders. From this, we know there are roughly 200 Watchers that took human women for themselves, and from them came Nephilim. The book of Enoch tells us that the Watchers had a plan and made a pact with each other. Not only were they going to take human women for themselves, but they were going to set up their own system of rule and teach humans every manner of advanced technology and knowledge. In this 1,296 years of the Watchers, there was an unending explosion of technology. Now keep in mind, they were not doing this out of some benevolent feeling towards mankind. They were doing it to pervert God's plan. In fact, we are told in chapter 7 in the book of Enoch, "And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and to drink the blood. The earth laid accusation against the lawless ones." They were also taking part in bestiality, and yes, there were offspring from this. It is from these abominations that we clearly get our mythology such as Minotaurs, Centaurs, and so on. From the Nephilim, which were the offspring of Watchers mating with human women, we get what the Bible tells us are the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This is where we get our legends of Hercules and other demagogues that were giants. I believe the Watchers themselves are also seen in mythology in such characters as Poseidon, Zeus, and so on. At this point, it may be getting hard to mesh a very technologically advanced global civilization with fallen angels and giant demigogues, along with all kinds of mythical, half-angelic and half-animal creatures, all within vast empires and nations. I would remind you, lay aside your preconceived notions and look at what the data is telling you. And by all means, investigate it for yourself.
Not only did the lost city of Atlantis actually exist, but its true location has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, completely unnoticed, as we've been looking in all the wrong places for its location, since everyone assumes that it must be under the ocean somewhere, such as in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, which have long been considered to be the most likely places for its existence. And no, I am not about to suggest that Antarctica is the hidden location of Atlantis either. Because in this video, I'm going to use the exact words that Plato used to describe Atlantis, its location, and the geographical land features that surround it, which were recorded in Plato's dialogues, the Critias and the Timaeus. And many people are not even aware that the information contained in Plato's writings of Atlantis actually originate from the ancient Egyptians. And the details that Plato shared of Atlantis, which I'm about to share with you in a side-by-side comparison, will show you that the Rakart structure located in Mauritania, Africa, also commonly referred to as the Eye of the Sahara or the Eye of Africa, which most people have never even heard of, by the way, is the most likely location for the lost city of Atlantis, as it matches so many precise details of what Plato wrote. But it must first be mentioned that according to mainstream academics and historians, the legend of Atlantis is simply fictional and has been commonly referred to as a myth or even pseudo-history, which completely contradicts Plato and Solon, which described an empire referred to as Atlantis, which was known for being technologically advanced, with noble and powerful people possessing vast wealth, luxury, and knowledge, and even military superiority, and is described as being destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune, which caused the island of Atlantis to disappear into the depths of the sea, related to a massive earthquake and likely a tsunami. So first things first, Plato received all the information about Atlantis from Solon, who was his ancestral relative separated by 6 generations. Solon was born in Athens, Greece, some 2,600 years ago, and was an Athenian statesman, lawmaker, and poet, remembered particularly for his efforts to legislate against political corruption and economic and social decline in Athens. He was known to be a person of wisdom and outstanding character. In Solon's later years, he traveled to Egypt in the search of knowledge, and Egypt at that time had the longest documented historical records available. And he visited Neph's temple at Sais, where he learned of the history of Atlantis from a high Egyptian priest who translated the hieroglyphs that were carved into stone within the temple, which also described that Egypt was once a colony of the Empire of Atlantis. And Neph's temple no longer exists today, as it was destroyed long ago when it was consumed by what is now the Nile Delta swamplands. However, thanks to Solon's detailed notes, the information was retained and kept for 6 generations within Plato's family, before it was published by Plato himself in the Critias and the Timaeus dialogues approximately 2,400 years ago. So one of the first things to point out is the supposed date of Atlantis' destruction according to what Solon had learned while visiting Egypt, which was that the event that destroyed the lost city had occurred 9,000 years earlier, which is a very interesting time frame, considering that Solon visited Egypt 2,600 years ago. And 9,000 years plus 2,600 years equates to 11,600 years before present time today. But what are the odds that this date of 11,600 years ago would match so perfectly? And that's not the only thing that matches up so closely. Most notably, Atlantis was said to be made up of concentric circles, 3 rings of water and 2 of land. In fact, here are Plato's exact words. There were alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which were turned as if with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center. And here you can see a few animated examples of what people have created based off of Plato's description of Atlantis. Now, compare this to the Ricard structure. Just look at this. The first thing that you must understand when you see this is that this is far larger than it looks. For example, this photo right here was taken from high altitude, and what you're seeing is something around 20 miles across, or 32 kilometers. And this particular photo does not even show the entire structure, which is approximately 30 miles or 48 kilometers across. And this site can really only be appreciated from space and satellite imagery, as it covers a vast area. In fact, the Ricard structure wasn't even discovered until the Gemini 4 mission in 1965, and is now a common landmark utilized by astronauts. This thing was hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, but when you look at photos of it from the ground, you have no idea what you're looking at. Only from the sky can you understand that you are part of this massive structure containing circles within circles. And in this example, you can see one of the outer rings in the distance, yet from the ground it just looks like a hill. It's remarkable at just how much it does resemble an eye, and it makes perfect sense as to why it was given the nickname of the Eye of the Sahara and the Eye of Africa. And by the way, it is located approximately 250 miles or 400 kilometers inland off the coast of West Africa in a very remote area which is rarely visited and again unknown to most people. What's even more fascinating than its size and shape is that scientists do not know what it is or how it was formed. In fact, scientists have never seen anything like this anywhere else throughout the entire world. But here's where things start to get really interesting. It just so happens that the diameter of its outer circle is approximately 23.5 kilometers or 14.5 miles, which is basically equivalent to the size and dimensions provided by Plato when converting from stadia to modern measurements. For example, the circular island of Atlantis was described as being 127 stadia. Well, 1 stadia is 607 feet, and 607 feet times 127 stadia is 77,089 feet. Convert that measurement, and that is 23.5 kilometers. I measured this numerous times on Google Earth, and I got anywhere from 21 kilometers to 24 kilometers. Most of my measurements were 22 kilometers in diameter, and again, this is virtually identical to Plato's and Solon's documentation. And although my own measurements through Google Earth cannot be considered exact, it is unbelievably close. So where we're at so far is that the Ricard structure matches Plato's description of having 3 circles of water and 2 of land, which is what you would see at the Ricard based off its design if there were water flowing into it. And not only that, the diameter of the outer circles matches the size described by Plato within a very small margin, if not identical. But this next detail that Plato describes is extremely interesting. He stated, and quote, "The mountains of the island of Atlantis was celebrated for their number and size and beauty," adding that the surrounding mountains of the city flowed with rivers, and this part of the island looked toward the south and was sheltered from the north. So he is stating that the mountains were on the north side, sheltering the city to the south, which is exactly what you see at the Ricard, and the mountains are on the north side. But not only that, when you look at detailed satellite photography, you can see the evidence of multiple rivers that were spilling over the side of the mountains towards Atlantis. Can you imagine what this place looked like when it wasn't so dry? Just like Plato stated, the mountains of the island of Atlantis were celebrated for their number and size and beauty. And it becomes even more compelling when you consider that Plato stated that the city of Atlantis opened up to the sea at the south. Well, look at these photos where you can see that there is an opening at the south of the Ricard structure. So if there was once water here and if it neighbored the sea, this would further match Plato's description. I mean, doesn't this match what a waterway outlet would look like? And not only that, doesn't the entire region look like it was blasted by flowing water or a tsunami? You can see the striations in the land going from west to east from the ocean. Tell me that this doesn't look like a massive wave or a steady flow of water completely altered the terrain. And it's also worth mentioning that scientists have emphasized that the Ricard is heavily eroded, which the circular walls clearly show us. Now, consider Plato's exact words in regards to the aftermath of the cataclysm. Quote, "Atlantis is part of the Atlantic which is no longer accessible by ship. Atlantis, when sunk by the earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. In other words, it became landlocked." Again, if this is the site of Atlantis, and if the details shared by Solon and Plato are true, and if the Ricard structure was the site of Atlantis, then it's not hard to see that perhaps a lot of sand or mud was pushed into Africa from the ocean during some sort of catastrophic event. And let's not forget the key detail that he mentioned regarding that the area surrounding Atlantis was a level plain which was smooth and even. Is this not another match when compared to the Ricard? Because here you can see multiple views and angles of it. And Plato said that Atlantis was sheltered by mountains to the north that were facing the south, and that the south part of Atlantis opened to the sea. So isn't that what we're seeing here, assuming that the ocean was once much further inland? And something else we should consider is that the sands of the Sahara actually originate from the sea, an interesting fact that many people are not aware of. And just to give you a comparison of just how massive this region is, compare it to the size of the United States. Perhaps the remnants of Atlantis are now under the Sahara Desert. Now here is another geological detail that matches Plato's description. He stated, quote, "The stone which they quarried was white, another black, and a third red," going on to say that the main city was constructed with red, black, and white rocks. This region just so happens to have endless amounts of loose rock which match these colors, particularly black and red, but we also see lighter colors mixed in with them as well. And real quick, what you're looking at are a few screenshots from an outstanding documentary titled Visiting Atlantis, which was filmed in 2011 by George S. Alexander and Natalice Rosen. That documentary goes on to point out that the center island of the Ricard has fresh spring water that flows from it. And this here is a not so great screenshot from that documentary where the locals dug a well to prove that fresh spring water flowed from the center island of the Ricard, despite the fact that the underground water in the surrounding area is all salt water, which is interesting considering that this is 250 miles from the ocean, perhaps further evidence that this site once met the sea. This detail about the fresh spring water coming out of the center island is significant when you compare it to what Plato said, quote, "The god Poseidon found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up two springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water, the other of cold." And he also specifically stated that a well near the central Acropolis provided the city with fresh water. So let's take a second to consider all the details regarding the Eye of the Sahara and Plato's description of Atlantis. First, Atlantis was said to have been destroyed 11,600 years ago, coinciding precisely with the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. It's a circular structure that would have been made up of 3 rings of water and 2 of land, which would be the case at the Ricard if it had water in it. It has a diameter of 23.5 kilometers, which matches Plato's description of it. There are mountains to the north, which also have evidence of rivers flowing over them, just as Plato described. The entire area is surrounded by a vast plain. The south opened up to the sea, which again, if the sea were further inland, it would match the description. And if there was a tsunami that cut Atlantis off from the ocean with mud, as Plato described, then you can see in the satellite imagery how this would be possible. The center island also had fresh spring water, just as described by Plato, and despite the fact that the surrounding area has salt water underground. And the region also has black, red, and lighter color rocks. And there are other details described by Plato that I haven't even mentioned. If the Ricard structure is indeed Atlantis, then we have to ask ourselves whether this unusual land feature is natural or could it be man-made? Is it possible that what we're looking at is a man-made creation, or perhaps could it be a combination? A very unusual land feature that humans took over and modified to be an oasis for a civilization. You want to hear another fascinating detail? So the legend of Atlantis states that it was an empire made up of 10 kingdoms, and the island of Atlantis was the capital. And the god Poseidon gave birth to 5 sets of twins, so 10 children, and each one of those children went on to rule each one of those 10 kingdoms. And like I mentioned earlier, according to the experts, Atlantis is just a fictional story that Plato made up to encourage better behavior among governments and its citizens. And modern academics are saying that the story of Atlantis must be false. Yet Plato and Solon were known for their brilliance of mind and strength of character. And this is the only example, at least that I'm aware of, where they were ever accused of lying about something. And the Egyptian description of Atlantis at the Temple of Neith in Sais, Egypt, no longer exists today, although perhaps those stones could be found underneath the Nile River somewhere, but it did exist for several hundred years, possibly a millennia. And I'm having difficulty finding an exact date on the temple's destruction by the Nile River, but it was long after Solon and Plato had died. So why would Solon and Plato lie about something that could be verified back then, as it was common for people to travel to Egypt, and the temple still existed at that time? And by the way, I have to point out something really interesting and, well, honestly a bit disturbing, which is that if you go to the Wikipedia page of the Ricart structure, you will not find one single word about Atlantis. And when you go to the Atlantis page on Wikipedia, you will not find one single word about the Ricart structure either. In fact, if you go to the page related to various hypotheses for the location of Atlantis, you will not find one single word related to the Ricart structure or the Eye of Africa. Nothing. And guess what else? Wiki has locked their page on Atlantis, only allowing certain unknown individuals the capability of editing the page, but whoever created it certainly made sure to mention the words pseudo-history in the first few sentences for all to see. The interest in the Eye of the Sahara is not just limited to us here chatting about it over the internet, because it turns out that the CIA has also had quite an interest in this place as well, and it goes back decades. So get this, there are declassified CIA documents on the Rishat structure, the Eye of the Sahara. That's right, and I've seen the released files with my own eyes, and I'm going to share them with you here as well. And I have to say that this stuff is beyond interesting. However, let me just say that there's nothing in these declassified files that say anything about Atlantis or lost ancient civilizations. What they do say is quite interesting. However, what these files do not say, the parts that are redacted and still classified, is really going to get you thinking. So where do I begin? Well, it turns out in 1967, the CIA conducted a secret mission where they sent military aircraft to conduct covert surveillance and scientific experiments on about a dozen different sites from around the world to study for geomagnetic anomalies. And of the few places in the world that they chose to study on this top secret mission, the mysterious Eye of the Sahara just so happened to be one of them. And like I said, the stated purpose of studying these sites was for identifying geomagnetic anomalies, which, if you're not familiar, the Earth's geomagnetic field is what shields us from the vastness of space, which, when you think about it, is incredible. I mean, it allows our planet to travel through the cosmos at incredible speeds, all while protected from the vacuum of space as we live comfortably and safely within a seemingly invisible shield that's in the shape of a bubble. So now that this secret mission is declassified, what were the results of that mission and the scientific experiments? Well, we don't know, because that part is still classified, as there is nothing in these release files that say anything about what the findings of their scientific study were related to geomagnetic anomalies or their covert surveillance. Which is utterly weird when you consider that this was back in 1967, 54 years ago from 2021, and we still don't get to know what the results of their findings were? So yeah, is it just me, or is that strangely interesting? But here's the thing, that is just the beginning of where things start to get weird. In fact, that is probably the least interesting part of these declassified files. Now, before I share that next part, I must first revisit a few of the remarkable similarities between the Eye of the Sahara to that of the tale of Atlantis, so that way we can all truly appreciate just how interesting / bizarre all of this actually is. As I discussed in my previous videos, the story of Atlantis originates from the ancient Egyptians, and They had described an empire named Atlantis, which consisted of 10 kingdoms, and the capital of Atlantis was on an island that consisted of 3 rings of water and 2 of land, which, of course, when we look at the Rishat structure, you see that it would precisely match that specific detail of 3 rings of water and 2 of land. And not only that, it was said to open to the sea at the south, which is exactly what you see here at the Rishat. In fact, you can literally see the striations in the sand where water once flowed through it. But not only that, those white blemishes are indeed salt. An unbelievably significant detail which I'll discuss more of in a moment. But considering that we now know that the Sahara Desert didn't even exist until somewhere around 11,600 years ago, where it went from green to desert in practically an instant. But many people are not aware of this incredible fact that the Sahara had previously been a lush green tropical paradise at the same time that Atlantis was said to exist. In fact, it was said to be made up of the largest freshwater lakes and rivers ever known to exist anywhere on Earth. Atlantis was said to be created by the god Poseidon, and Poseidon had 10 children that came from 5 sets of male twins. And each of these 10 children would individually be ruler of the 10 kingdoms that made up the empire of Atlantis. And the firstborn would rule the capital, and his name was Atlas. So does anyone want to guess who the name of the first king of Mauritania was? King Atlas, who ruled over the Mori people, which is why the land is called Mauritania today. And not only that, the vast mountain region located north of the Rishat just so happens to be named the Atlas Mountains. What a coincidence. Now, another incredible detail involves this map. Herodotus is considered by many to be the father of history due to his extensive historical documentation. In fact, we wouldn't even know about the Greco-Persian Wars if it wasn't for him. And some 2,500 years ago, he made a written detailed account of the known world at that time. However, he himself did not draw out this map. Others, and I do not know who or when, read through his various works and annotated that the people of Atlantis lived in this region you see here, which just so happens to be the same general location of the Rishat structure. What are the odds of that? The very same place that has a highly unusual land feature that consists of symmetrical rings. But let me first circle back to the declassified files on the Eye of the Sahara. Like I mentioned, these files do not say anything about Atlantis or lost ancient civilizations, nor do they include the very results of the scientific study for geomagnetic anomalies, which is so weird considering, again, it's 54 years later, and we're still not allowed to know, because here's what I consider to be the weirdest part of all, which involves the entire context of this study itself. Quote, while the scientific aspects of this survey are totally unclassified and available to the worldwide scientific community, blank, redacted, not unclassified, as in still classified 54 years later in 2021. Let me read that again. While the scientific aspects of this survey are totally unclassified and available to the worldwide scientific community, nothing. What did the rest of this half page that is now whited out and redacted, and even which continues on to a small portion on the next page, what did all of this say? It's quite literally the entire context of the mission itself, and yet it's still classified. They purposely removed it decades later. So ask yourself, 1, why did they end up not including the results of their findings within the released declassified files, despite the fact that they said that they would? 2, why did they classify the mission itself when they had also first said that it wasn't going to be? And 3, why is this giant portion redacted from the declassified files themselves? Like I said at the beginning of this video, that is strangely interesting, isn't it? But let me be clear, I am not suggesting that these files had anything to do with Atlantis. But at the same time, I do find it interesting in that Atlantis was said to have special geologic properties to it. For example, the center island of the capital was said to have 2 springs of fresh water, one of cold, the other warm, and that in itself would be geologically unique. So the fact that there was something about this site that led to a top secret study for geomagnetic properties makes me wonder, particularly when you realize that most of it is still classified in so many decades later. So despite the striking similarities at the wrist shot in comparison to Atlantis, many people still have doubts that the eye could even possibly be the location, as the structure today is more than 1,200 feet above sea level. So how could this place be the location of an island that once met the ocean? Well, notice the various areas of white coloration that you see not only from the air, but from satellite imagery as well. These white blemishes are indeed salt. You can even go there and taste it right off the ground yourself, as my journalist friend Josh Sigurdsson did, and what an insanely epic trip he had to this site. In fact, he almost died, and I encourage all of you to go and watch his video on BitChute. But something many people do not know is that this region has an abundance of salt at surface level. In fact, you can read articles about the salt caravans that exist in Mauritania today. This is something that is widely documented yet little known. This salt came from the ocean, and you can literally see it in the exact areas where cataclysmic flooding once flowed through here, as you can see from satellite imagery. And even the areas of the lowest elevation within the wrist shot are the areas with the most salt, making it even more evident that salt water once consumed and settled within this structure. And you'll also see it noticeably at the southern entrance, respectively. It's worth noting that the highly respected Randall Carlson himself has analyzed this site and stated that it is a location of cataclysmic water erosion. He actually went into detail about this on his own YouTube channel, and I highly recommend you check it out, and I'll leave a link in the description down below. But let me play a couple short clips so you can hear it directly from him.
Okay. And in fact, I'll show you in a minute, it looks like there was evidence for extreme floods over this whole landscape. You can see incised by erosion. This is obviously water erosion here.
And he goes on to make the comparison of the massive recessional cataracts found at Dry Falls in Washington State, which were caused by cataclysmic flooding at the end of the last ice age. Well, it turns out that the wrist shot itself has the same type of water erosion as well, as he points out here.
Which is very interesting. You see what actually looks like recessional cataracts.
Yeah.
So the stripping and exposure of this feature may have involved catastrophism.
Now, hold on to that thought, because he goes on to point out that you can even see the landmark water ripples created from immense levels of water flow all around the wrist shot, which matches the landmark ripples observed in the northwestern United States in the same exact region as the Dry Falls recessional cataracts as I just shared. The pictures you see here are at the Missoula floodplains in Washington State and Montana, which Randall Carlson was discussing. And those massive ripples are hundreds of feet wide and can only be appreciated from the air as they are that big, which further illustrates the level of cataclysmic flooding this area once endured some 12,000 years ago. And real quick, just for frame of reference, compare the small ripples we've all seen at the beach. And in fact, just the other day, I had a great synchronicity while I was walking my dog along a canal and noticed the same small sand ripples at the bottom. So now listen to what Mr. Carlson shares with us about the wrist shot.
Look right here. You see the current ripples? Now there's sand between them, but if these are similar to the current giant current ripples we see out in Washington and Montana, and notice the texture here, passing over the region out to sea right here. And if we zoom in, and
Okay.
yeah, so this is southwest of the actual structure. So what it appears to me is sometimes you had tremendous processes at work here. Oh yeah, look at this, a beautiful, oh man, there it is.
Wow.
There it is. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Intense.
Now, something that Randall makes no mention of is the existing salt found all around this area, including the images he shares on screen, as you can observe throughout this image in the area, all those white blemishes. We can even reference the nearby Tashit, Mauritania salt caravans I shared a few moments ago. All of those white blemishes are surface level salt, and I'd be very curious to hear what Randall Carlson's thoughts are on this important detail. Again, this is how you know the wrist shot was consumed by the ocean within the last 12,000 years by some unknown cataclysmic flooding event, because Let's not forget that the latest scientific studies have proven that the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise up until around 11,600 or so years ago, which is when it started to become the vast desert we all know today. And the sands of the Sahara are known to have come from the ocean after this transition to the desert happened, and the fact that the sand has salt on top of it is how you know that the ocean flooded over this region far more recently than most realize. You see, most have assumed that the last time North Africa was under the ocean was between 50 and 66 million years ago. And that was the time of the Trans-Saharan Seaway. But notice that this seaway does not annotate it going over the area of the Richat structure. Rather, it goes south. Yet, clearly, the same landmark evidence of cataclysmic flooding did flow over the Richat, which is evident, and also confirmed by experts such as Carlson himself, which indicates that something else, something separate, happened over this area far more recently. And the fact that these landmark water ripples still exist in the same fashion as the identical ripples in Washington state only further adds to the corresponding evidence that something happened over the Richat at that same period of time. There's obviously more to the story, as clearly something happened to North Africa far more recently. And when we discuss cataclysmic flooding 11,600 years ago, let's compare that to the time frame to other separate declassified CIA documents that I also discussed in a different video a couple years ago. There is a book called The Adam and Eve Story, which was discussed in a secret CIA meeting some 50 years ago, and the book itself was not classified, as some have thought, but the reason why this book was discussed in a CIA meeting in the first place is still classified. But in that book, the author, Chan Thomas, described events that happen routinely on Earth that cause biblical levels of ocean flooding over entire continents. And look at the date on that. Identical to the 11,600 year date I've just been discussing, and keep in mind this book was written 50 plus years ago, so where it says 11,550 years ago is actually the same date today. But I mean, come on, what are the odds of that? The same date described continental flooding, and here we have the Sahara Desert that looks like it was obliterated by a continental-sized flood. And if you haven't watched my video on that, go check it out, as it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a connection to what we're seeing at the Richat and North Africa. And that's not all that's to be said about the 11,600 year date, as it is the same exact date that Atlantis was said to have been destroyed, as Solon went to Egypt in 600 BC and was told that Atlantis had been destroyed precisely 9,000 years earlier. Well, 600 BC is 2,600 years ago from today, and then add the 9,000 years on top of it, and it equates to precisely 11,600 years ago. That is far too precise to be a coincidence, and if you ask me, it is legitimate evidence that Atlantis actually existed. But if that's not overwhelming enough, the 11,600 year date is also the same exact timing of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe that occurred 11,600 years ago and instigated what is referred to as Meltwater Pulse 1b. There was a sudden and rapid rise in global sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and again, 11,600 years ago. All of the dots connect here, and it's apparent for all who have eyes to see. Something really bad happened on Earth at that period of time, and it's weird that this isn't discussed in more headline news. Again, I don't know what happened to North Africa 11 to 12,000 years ago, nor do I know what happened there in the 10,000 years since. But the very fact that the sand is there and the salt is on top of it says it all. But people will say, if this was indeed the location of Atlantis, then where are the artifacts and remnants of destroyed buildings? Well, considering that the massive flooding stripped away the bedrock itself, that means that everything that would have been built above it would have been swept away along with that bedrock that once sat on top of. So here's a short clip of Mr. Carlson addressing this.
It does appear that there were extreme floods and fluvial erosion over the plateau that would have been ultimately responsible for exposing the core of this unique structure that would have been buried beneath, many hundreds of feet, maybe thousands of feet of bedrock at one time.
Clearly, if flooding occurred that was strong enough to strip bedrock, you're not going to remove the bedrock without removing everything else that was on top of it. It's the same concept of the so-called tablecloth trick, except that that trick obviously wouldn't work in the case of catastrophic flooding. So if we're talking about removing hundreds and possibly even thousands of feet of bedrock, there would be no structures left to be found. In fact, it would have been swept away into the Atlantic Ocean, which plummets to depths exceeding 11,000 feet, or more than 3,400 meters, not far off the coast. Even the shallow-looking areas you see here are at depths of more than 1,000 feet, practically instantly off the coast of Africa. So any stone block from buildings would have been pummeled to pebbles long before then, and making it highly unlikely for anything to ever be found. But still, who knows what could be laying at unknown depths under the dirt in the area between the Richat and the Atlantic Ocean. But that aside, here's another interesting point to be made. People will say that since the Richat is not an island, and since it's not located west of the Pillars of Hercules or the Straits of Gibraltar, it could not be the location of Atlantis. However, keep in mind that the Empire of Atlantis was made up of 10 kingdoms. For example, I shared that Atlas was the firstborn and was ruler of the capital, but Gades was the second-born, and there is a region in southern Spain just outside the Straits of Gibraltar that once had that exact same name. What are the odds? I would argue that this whole region was the area where we would find the 10 kingdoms that make up Atlantis. I simply suggest that the Richat would be the most likely location for the capital. And if that's the case, the locations of the other 9 kingdoms would surely be within this region. And I must mention that Randall Carlson puts forth an excellent argument for considering the Azores, which is an island chain found directly west of the Straits. However, many people are looking for an island that's now at the bottom of the ocean. However, we must consider that this is a 12,000-year-old story that was passed down by numerous people in multiple different languages. And so now here is one huge detail that is either unknown or not shared by researchers, which is that the ancient Greek word that was used by Plato to describe island was the word Nessos. Well, you might be quite surprised to know that the word Nessos actually had 5 meanings to the ancient Greeks, including the words island, promontory, peninsula, coast, and even land within a continent that is surrounded by lakes, rivers, or streams. My goodness, that certainly qualifies the Richat structure. People in modern times allow themselves to get caught up by the word island without thoroughly researching the history of its translation. And another profound detail why we should not be looking for Atlantis at the bottom of the ocean is because when you specifically read what Plato actually wrote in describing Atlantis' final resting place, he states, quote, "And the island of Atlantis was similarly swallowed up by the sea and vanished. This is why the sea in that area is to this day impassable to navigation, which is hindered by mud just below the surface, the remains of the sunken island." That in no way describes an island that sank to the bottom of the ocean. Furthermore, if you go to the Temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt today, the ancients carved in stone that they had came from the primeval ones, who were survivors of an island that was destroyed in a cataclysm, and they specifically stated that all that was left of that land were the reeds, which is grass, that was still penetrating through the water where it had been submerged, meaning that it was at such shallow depths that the grass could still be seen. Even Graham Hancock has discussed this in detail in lectures as well as in his book, Magician of the Gods, which I highly recommend. But the point is that the destroyed capital is not at the bottom of the ocean, and it was never said to be. Unfortunately, many researchers and scholars in modern times have deviated from the actual wording of Plato and did not go to the extent to thoroughly research the ancient translations of his specific wording. Hence why, despite the extensive underwater searching for Atlantis over the past several decades has led to nothing.
At this point, you may be thinking this is a little much, and for sure is way beyond our current paradigms. But think about this. Many decades ago, when God was removed from our education systems, His truth wasn't just replaced with a lie. It was replaced with lie upon lie upon lie. Satan and all of that family are ingenious and master deceivers that work brilliantly laid plans over time. People in this age of deception struggle, if not find it impossible, to discern fact from fiction when it contradicts the well-placed modern paradigms, even when presented with overwhelming evidence. So far, we have been standing on completely solid ground, presenting biblical fact and archaeological evidence. If what we have covered so far seems a bit much, it may be worth starting over at this point and view it again to truly mull over what's being presented so far. In fact, there is actually a lot more information along these lines dealing with the pyramids and other locations I would like to share, but it would require a lot more time, and we need to move on because the purpose of this information is to gain a fuller understanding of the time of Noah. But before we move to that, it is important to take a look at the technology of this lost world. You see, when I say they were more advanced than we are, this is actually an understatement. All we have left of this lost world to look at is the stone structures left by the flood. But from the archaeological record in both the biblical references and accounts, we know this civilization was advanced to a point that we could only dream about right now.
The first site in Tiwanaku that we wanted to visit was Pumapunku. Pumapunku is perhaps one of the best examples on Earth of incomprehensibly advanced technology in the distant past, which according to conventional history should not exist.
What's really interesting is that many of the early chroniclers that visited Pumapunku were convinced that A, it was built by giants, and B, it was definitely built before the Great Flood. And the Incas also believed that. The Spanish chroniclers accompanying Francisco Pizarro during his conquest of Peru recorded that the Incas believed that Pumapunku had been constructed by a race of ancient giants called the Huaris and was already in ruins before their civilization began. According to the Inca, this race of giants was created by the god Viracocha, who rose up from the depths of Lake Titicaca.
Because of the tight security in the area, we decided to be as low-key as possible and try not to give the impression that we were shooting video. So we opted not to use the lapel mic, and our cameraman pretended to be taking pictures instead of filming. I was surprised to find that the ruins of Pumapunku are now completely roped off, which we were told is a measure of control that had been only recently implemented. In fact, you're not even allowed to touch the stones anymore, which is of course unacceptable if your purpose is to conduct a thorough investigation. We certainly didn't come all that way just to stand there and stare at the stones. Our logistics guy, Benny, at one point went over and distracted the guards so that me and the cameraman could jump the lines and perform a proper analysis. Now, I had reviewed a lot of photos and footage of Pumapunku before visiting the site myself, but I have to say that images do not do it justice. You have to get up close to these magnificent blocks of hard andesite and actually put your hands on them to really appreciate how masterful the builders were. I was thoroughly amazed at the impossible craftsmanship I witnessed in the stone. Incredibly precise right angles, intricate engravings, ingenious interlocking pieces, and surfaces that were still glassy smooth, even after being blasted by thousands of years of wind and rain. There were stones incorporated into the structures at Pumapunku that literally weighed hundreds of tons, and according to archaeologists, were quarried from over 60 miles away. Some say 200 miles away. The megalithic blocks at Pumapunku are primarily comprised of solid andesite and red sandstone. Now, obviously, red sandstone is a softer rock than andesite, but it seemed to me that for the builders of Pumapunku, andesite was just as easy to work with as sandstone, because the very same level of precision is exhibited in both.
We have two different kinds of stones represented here, at least in this area we're in right now. We have these huge megalithic sandstone blocks, but then we also have very, very hard andesite blocks.
Apart from the incredibly precise cuts and smooth surfaces, these massive building blocks were designed with modular fittings to interlock with one another. It is also apparent that at least some of the stones were held together by additional eye-shaped metal clamps, very likely poured into the molds carved directly into the stone. Although the actual clamps themselves have been long since plundered, the impressions or molds of the clamps are still evident in the stone.
Conventional archaeologists maintain that a pre-Inca civilization using primitive tools and without even the benefit of the wheel or a written language for that matter were the builders of Pumapunku. The controllers of history want us to believe that the ancient world was primitive, ignorant, and yet at the same time they were somehow able to accomplish impossible things, such as build palaces like Pumapunku, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, all the ancient wonders of the world. And they did it, by the way, with only ropes, stone hammers, and copper chisels. They can't have it both ways.
En la visita que hoy hemos hecho al lugar que se llama Pumapunku en Tiahuanaco, entonces hemos podido verificar que las piedras tienen un acabado bastante fino, ¿no? Tiene un acabado vidriado, que de tal manera que parece un espejo el acabado de cada piedra.
H-blocks here, the famous H-blocks of Pumapunku, appear to have had at one time a vitrified glass-like surface, and he says that all of the blocks like this used to be covered with this kind of very smooth glass-like surface, but over time it's worn off.
Entonces, la posibilidad es que mucho más antes ha existido una tecnología que nuestra historia, en su línea del tiempo, lo ha perdido.
This civilization was indisputably in possession of advanced knowledge and working with what can only be described as advanced technology that we believe was ultimately derived from the teachings of the Watchers as defined in the Genesis 6 narrative in the Old Testament. In fact, Arthur Poznański, a well-known and well-respected engineer and archaeologist who studied Tiwanaku for over 50 years during the early 20th century, discovered huge elongated skulls while excavating the area.
The whole time our team was at the Pumapunku location, we were impressed with the notion that what we were seeing was just literally the tip of the iceberg. In other words, the vast majority of the ruins of Pumapunku are still buried under the ground. One gets the distinct sense that there is much more buried under the ground at Pumapunku than what has been presented on the surface. Artifacts and secrets that somebody doesn't want dug up.
The research of Arthur Poznański revealed that Pumapunku had been devastated in a massive flood that deposited at least 6 feet of sediment over the whole area. Seashells and tropical plant residues have been excavated in this layer of sediment. What we have in Pumapunku is evidence of the great flood of Noah. The stones themselves, just like the Sphinx of Egypt, show evidence of having been submerged and eroded underwater.
Apart from showing signs of having been swallowed up in a massive flood, the structures also appear to have been decimated in some kind of an explosion before they were buried in the sediment. Fragments of andesite are scattered all throughout the area, as if a Hellfire missile had struck the structure and blown it to pieces. This is actually concurrent with the narrative found in the book of Enoch concerning the offspring of the Watchers, which annihilated each other in an epic war that preceded the flood of Noah. Added to all of this confusion is the ever-present conspiracy to cover up the evidence of the highly advanced non-human races that existed in the world before the flood of Noah. Tiwanaku, like most of the major antediluvian archaeological sites around the globe, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. UNESCO is an acronym for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. People have to understand that the narrative of history is carefully controlled and to a degree contrived to promote a Darwinian paradigm, and more importantly, to conceal the biblical reality of the world before the flood of Noah, when the hybrid offspring of the fallen angels walked the earth. The technology of these fallen entities and the knowledge they possessed is voraciously coveted by the secret societies and intelligence agencies operating in the shadows all around the world, and quickly confiscated wherever and whenever it is found.
Everywhere we go around the world, where our research leads us in looking for the evidence of giants, we run into the same cover-up. Not just the existence of giants, but of the pre-flood world in general. There is a concerted effort to hide the fact that there were advanced, highly advanced civilizations living in the dateless past. Not only do archaeologists deny this fact, but some of them have actually been caught staging artifacts to mislead the public.
Another Catholic church.
Like many ancient cultures around the world, the Inca built their temples and palaces on top of pre-existing foundations left over from the age before the flood. These were considered to be sacred sites imbued with spiritual energy, where the gods of the old world could still be contacted. When the Dominicans built their convent of Santo Domingo over the ruins of the Coricancha, they were taking possession of something far more mysterious and arcane than anything to do with the Inca.
Where is the golden disc?
So that's where the golden disc was located, right there on that wall.
The temple walls within the Coricancha were constructed with the same mortarless precision that is a trademark of pre-flood Cyclopean masons all over the world.
In the Coricancha, you also have the
No cement, no mortar.
the seamless stones here, no mortar.
The architectural style suggests that the same antediluvian race that built the megalithic constructions at Tiwanaku in Bolivia were also the original builders of these temple walls.
Inside of this walls there are grampas. Grampas is a staples of clubs in bronze made. We are going to see some examples of these stone pieces found in 1960s.
Are there blocks from Tiwanaku here in the temple?
Yes, the Tiwanakus arrived to Cusco in order to found it, in order to build this temple in a Tiwanaku style, like a Tiwanaku people. Now this architecture belongs to the Tiwanaku.
This is where they had copper. They had copper fittings here. There's some blocks of Tiwanaku. This is an example. This is the Tiwanaku architecture.
This one too, this is
Tiwanaku.
Double group shapes. This is the club. This club is a Tiwanaku device.
This is the famous stone where they drilled it. Danny, check this out. This is a famous stone here in Coricancha, where it appears to have been machine drilled.
The megalithic ruins within the convent of Santo Domingo displayed universal signatures of a technologically superior race that was annihilated long ago in the waters of the Great Flood. However, unbeknownst to the thousands of tourists visiting the Coricancha every year, the most amazing works of these ancient master builders are not in view of the masses, but hidden beneath the church. There is an ancient legend that tells of a secret subterranean world connected by an enormous network of tunnels extending for hundreds of miles beneath the Andes Mountains and the Amazon jungle in South America. The nerve center where all these tunnels converge is said to be located underneath the city of Cusco in Peru, the very place known as the navel of the world. The natives called this underground labyrinth beneath Cusco the Shinkana, which is a Quechuan word meaning the place where one gets lost. And for good reason, because few of those who have entered into it have ever come out. The Shinkana is comprised of naturally occurring, deep subterranean caverns that are joined together by large artificially constructed tunnels, which are supported in some places by trapezoidal megalithic stone walls and ceilings, just like the doorways in the Temple of the Sun.
The Shinkana is essentially a subterranean highway that united many of the most significant antediluvian cities throughout South America with Cusco, and specifically with the megalithic fortress of Sacsayhuaman. We're talking about manufactured tunnels with cyclopean megalithic walls in some segments, running for hundreds of miles under the earth. We know, for example, that the natives told the Spaniards that Cusco was connected with Tiwanaku in Bolivia via the Shinkana, which is a distance of over 300 miles. In a sense, the Shinkana is the antediluvian equivalent of what we call today DUMBs, deep underground military bases.
What's important to understand about this ancient subterranean highway is how massive of an undertaking it would have been to accurately chart and construct it. And we're not just talking about a single tunnel. The ruined foundations of these megaliths, still standing like fleshless bones after thousands of years of inundation and weathering, bear witness to the builder gods of the pre-flood world, their hybrid offspring, and their celestial knowledge.
There exists a vast network of megaliths all over the planet, some of which are well known, like Baalbek in Lebanon and Stonehenge in England, while many others, such as the Bosnian Pyramid and the recently discovered megaliths in Siberia, have not even been officially acknowledged as artificial structures yet, because their unfathomable size absolutely demolishes the conventional paradigms of anthropology.
Not only are there megalithic ruins dispersed over every continent on the surface of the earth, many megalithic structures, like the Shinkana, are buried under the ground and sunken beneath the oceans. This is a worldwide phenomenon that is much more widespread and significant than anyone even realizes. One of the most impressive and important megalithic sites in the world is located just outside the city of Cusco. The Inca called it Sacsayhuaman.
The first thing that you need to know about Sacsayhuaman before formulating any conjectures concerning its construction or its builders is that what you are seeing is literally only the tip of the iceberg. When Anselm and his expeditionary team excavated at Sacsayhuaman, they discovered that more levels of these cyclopean walls were still buried beneath the sediment of the mountain, a testament to the fury and force of the Great Flood. The fact is that only 10 to 15% of this enormous megalithic complex has been unearthed, and what remains above ground today is much less than what was present centuries ago before the Spaniards dynamited and dismantled the higher segments of the walls for the construction of their own villas and cathedrals in the city of Cusco.
Each mammoth block incorporated in the walls of Sacsayhuaman is precisely and uniquely fitted with the ones surrounding it without the use of mortar. Some of these polygonal blocks weigh over 300 tons and stand over 20 feet tall. The quarry from which they are believed to have been extracted is over 20 miles away. Inca legend records that the walls of Sacsayhuaman were built by giants. The first Spaniards to lay eyes on these walls also believed that they could not have been built with human hands, and that they must have been the work of enchantment or demons.
If there was ever an example of an ancient construction that appears to have been built by giants, it's here in Sacsayhuaman. These massive stones have been fit so perfectly together that you can't even slip a piece of paper between them. This is incredible masonry beyond the capability of mere human beings, in my opinion.
The official narrative concerning the walls of Sacsayhuaman is that the Inca constructed them using ropes, ramps, and soft metal chisels, employing many thousands of workers for many decades, which is not only ridiculous, but also impossible for numerous reasons. During the course of his excavations, Anselm P. Rambla uncovered proof that earlier civilizations had occupied Sacsayhuaman long before the rise of the Incan Empire.
Although the Inca did not build the walls of Sacsayhuaman or any of the megaliths found throughout their empire, they did make use of them. Fortifications and towers devised by Incan masons were raised right on top of impregnable pre-flood foundations. The workmanship of the Inca sticks out like a sore thumb and represents a level of technology consistent with a Bronze Age civilization.
The mighty Cyclopean walls of Sacsayhuaman don't stand alone in Cusco. At one time, the entire city was a megalithic metropolis. The city of Cusco itself bears witness to the superior technology that once existed in the distant past. Many of the buildings lining its streets and back alleys have been built on top of ancient megalithic foundations. Since its fall to the conquistadors in the 16th century, numerous devastating earthquakes have rocked the city of Cusco. In every case, the walls of the cathedrals and villas built by the Spaniards came crumbling down, but the pre-flood Cyclopean walls stood fast.
Megaliths aren't just big. They're geometrically precise, intentionally and ingeniously devised to withstand extreme seismic activity. This is a kind of master masonry from the prehistoric past, far surpassing anything we can build with stone today. The difference between the two walls here in this one street in Cusco is astounding. This is the original construction. If you look straight down it, you'll see that it's straight. It's very well constructed, and it's leaning in a little bit, and they built these walls like this so that they could withstand earthquakes. This is the Spanish side of the wall, where the Spaniards took apart the blocks and reconstructed them here, and you can see that they used a lot of concrete. And if you look down this wall, you see that it is very poorly constructed in comparison to the original wall, very wavy, and you get the sense that this thing would come crashing down in the event of a large earthquake. The Cyclopean walls found throughout the region of Cusco are primarily comprised of hard andesite, basalt, and granite blocks, which have a distinguishing convex or pillowed surface to them with beveled joints, as if they were soft and malleable like clay when they were set into place and then pressed together.
There is reason to believe that the Antediluvians may have been able to somehow change the chemical composition or even the atomic structure of hard stone in order to make it softer and more pliable and possibly lighter. This may sound unbelievable, but it is consistent with what is observed in the streets of Cusco.
It appears that these two large boulders have been set on top of this rock here, while this rock was not entirely hard. In other words, this rock would have been soft, and these heavy rocks would have been placed on top of it, and they would have literally squished down into this rock on the bottom. And that is exactly what appears to have happened here.
Aside from these stones having the appearance of being pressed together, raised ridgelines can be seen on their outer parameters when adjacent stones are removed. This is yet another indication that these blocks may not have been carved, but set into place like lumps of clay where they molded into one another as they hardened.
It is apparent to anyone willing to think outside of the very limited parameters of conventional archaeology that the Cyclopean walls in Cusco represent in themselves a lost age of profound scientific knowledge and advanced technology. It is also apparent that neither the Inca nor any of the cultures they conquered were in possession of that knowledge. What is often overlooked is evidence indicating how suddenly devastation befell the builders of the megaliths. This is best illustrated in the place where the Inca won their greatest victory over the Spanish, Ollantaytambo.
Ollantaytambo is located about 40 miles outside of the city of Cusco and was built up as a defensive position by the Inca against the invading Spaniards. The constructions at Ollantaytambo represent a fusion of pre-flood Cyclopean masonry with inferior Bronze Age level masonry and demonstrates an attempt by the Inca to copy the Cyclopean style, but the stark contrast between the two is glaring.
Ollantaytambo has some of the most well-preserved and masterful Cyclopean masonry I've ever seen. Some of the curved corners in the walls are sculpted from single blocks and joined together with flawless precision. Just like at Sacsayhuaman and in the streets of Cusco, these walls were built at an inclination to withstand earthquakes. One of the amazing things about the engineering of these gigantic walls is that they were built on an inclination. This is a very advanced engineering, apart from the fact that these blocks are absolutely immense.
Ollantaytambo is the key for decoding the origin and sudden disappearance of the megalith builders in the Altiplano. Combined in this one location are two distinct Cyclopean architectural styles: the polygonal convex blocks of the Cusco region and the rectangular interlocking vitrified blocks of Tiwanaku. These two styles together suggest that they are related and have nothing to do with the Inca. Located at the summit of the constructions are some of the largest standing Tiwanaku-style blocks ever discovered.
So these are the famous megalithic stones here that make up part of the wall at the Temple of the Sun in Ollantaytambo. One of the interesting things that we notice, having come from Tiwanaku, is that we have these patterns that were being carved into these rocks, into the face of this wall, that are basically originate in Tiwanaku. And this is exactly what we're told by the guides, that whoever built this wall was either the same culture of the people who built in Tiwanaku, or they copied their form of construction. We're told that these smaller stones in between the large ones here were placed so that this structure would resist earthquakes, that when this structure began to shake, it would crush the smaller stones rather than the big stones cracking and falling. So it's a pretty ingenious construction they had up here. Each one of these rocks weighs, each one of these stones weighs somewhere between 70 and 100 tons each, and were quarried from the side of the mountain, way up high in the mountains up there, and somehow were brought and placed to where they are now.
These gigantic blocks were cut out of the bedrock near the peak of the mountain at very high elevations. and then carried down the mountain, over the river, across the valley, and up the dirt ramps that are still present to this day before being set into place without a scratch on them. This was, in every sense of the word, a superhuman feat. What is undeniable about Ollantaytambo is that whoever the builders of the megaliths were, they suddenly disappeared before finishing the project. Large blocks of stone were left lying on the ground, as if dropped in panic and confusion. It is claimed that this abrupt cessation in construction was due to the invasion of the conquistadors. But it is far more likely that the invading force was not the Spanish, but the waters of the Great Flood.
Here again, there is more material we would like to show, but we must move on. As we continue to the end of the antediluvian world, we reach the time of Noah. And it is here that Jesus warns humanity what the world will be like upon his second advent. The Bible tells us in Genesis 6, 5-7, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent and of thoughts of his heart was evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry I have made them."
We know that the Watchers descended to the earth in the age before the flood. Those fallen angels who kept not their first estate and are bound in chains of darkness, as plainly stated in the book of Jude and 2 Peter. We know that these Watchers taught mankind forbidden knowledge and corrupted the genetics of life on earth, even producing their own hybrid offspring with the daughters of men, the mighty giants of old, as well as many other genetic monsters conceived through their perverted acts of rebellion.
These perverted beings, these Watchers as they are called in the ancient texts, not only copulated with human women, but also with beasts, with animals. So you can imagine the genetic mess of unsanctioned sentient entities inhabiting the planet before God put a stop to it all, literally washing the slate clean in the waters of the flood.
The age before the flood of Noah was a time of extreme wickedness on the earth, a time of bloodlust, paganism, and sexual perversion, unparalleled in all of history. Mankind betrayed his creator and followed in the rebellion of the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, the fallen angels.
The chaos wrought by the Watchers persisted for over 1,000 years after their descent in the days of Jared until the flood of Noah, as reckoned in the Greek Septuagint. That's an incredible amount of time for the distribution and propagation of hereditary genes. That is to say, 1,000 years of mutations in the DNA of not only the human race, but many other species besides. The supernatural seed of the fallen Watchers was like a virus that ultimately infected everything.
Imagine the global empire of fallen angels and their hybrid offspring, the demigods of legend, giants, centaurs, satyrs, minotaurs, and a host of other genetic monsters roaming the planet and leading humanity in open rebellion against God for hundreds of years. This is what the ancients called the Golden Age, the time when the gods descended to commingle with men.
Like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, the Watchers brought down forbidden knowledge from heaven, knowledge that defiled the mind of man and hastened the destruction of the world.
At this point, we read in the book of Enoch in chapter 10, God sent Archangel Uriel to the son of Lamech with instruction for Noah. Then God dispatched Archangel Raphael to deal with Azazel, and the Archangel Gabriel to cause the Nephilim to wage war with one another and to wipe themselves out, all while their fathers, the Watchers, had to witness it. God also dispatched Archangel Michael to capture and bind the Watchers in a horrible place to await their judgment at the Great White Throne Judgment. This is also described in Jude 1:6 and 2 Peter 2:4, but I'll let you look those up for yourself. Now God has to deal with the polluted earth. I'm sure we all know why it was Noah and his family that were spared and used to continue life on earth, so I'll just briefly mention it. We know from Genesis 6:9-12 that Noah and his family were not contaminated by Watcher DNA, which if you look up the original Greek on verse 9, that is very evident. We also know that Noah walked with God. God was who he worshipped and obeyed, and God was pleased with him. Of course, everyone knows what comes next, the flood. God wiped the slate clean on earth, and yes, I am saying on earth intentionally. And then he allowed and helped Noah and his family, along with the preserved uncontaminated animals, to start over. So if we were to say, what are some bullet points that mark the age of Noah that we could examine? I would list them as 1. Rampant wickedness throughout the planet. 2. The presence of fallen angels on the earth and interacting with humans. And 3. DNA alteration of humans so that they are no longer fully human, and this would also affect animal life to varying degrees. However, before we move on to explore these bullet points in the next podcast, there is one more thing I would like to cover from the days of Noah, in particular, the days shortly before the flood. We know from the Bible that even after the clean slate of the world, Nephilim were found back on the planet. They were found in a number of places in the Old Testament, such as when the Israelites reached Canaan, and everyone also knows the story of David and Goliath. But have you ever wondered how that was possible? Well, the easiest explanation is other fallen angels repeated what the Watchers did. However, if you put some thought to it, that actually makes no sense at all, and here's why. First, the Bible doesn't tell us that other fallen angels took human wives. Second, these are not the same Nephilim that were the mighty men or men of old that were the men of renown. For sure they were giants, and they were physically superior to humans, but if you read the descriptions of both throughout the Bible and the book of Enoch, these Nephilim were clearly lesser than the ones before them, almost as if they had been created from the genes of the ones before them, much like an analog copy loses some of its quality with each time it's copied. And third, which is also the best evidence I believe, is that when you look at how God dealt with the Watchers, well, to put it in today's vernacular, he curb stomped them. He made them watch their offspring kill each other, and then he had them bound in a place worse than hell to suffer until the Great White Throne Judgment, where they would then be cast into the lake of fire. God was absolutely sending a message to all remaining fallen angels saying that if you think your fate is bad now, try doing that again and see what happens. So I don't think Satan and the other fallen angels got together and said, well, let's do that again. If at first you don't succeed, try again. That just makes no sense. So if the other fallen angels were smart enough not to repeat what the Watchers did, then how do we have Nephilim after the flood? Well, do you recall earlier when I said I would be reminding you of Ecclesiastes 1, 9, and 10? What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. So everything we see around us has happened in some form or another in the world that perished, but that also includes what we see above us. Now for sure, I freely admit we're venturing into hypothesis and theory here, but I will present this theory to you and let you make up your own mind.
The plumed serpent deities of the Maya, Aztec, and Inca, known as Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and Amaru, were often portrayed in human form and in stark contrast with their native subjects, having the appearance of tall, white-skinned men with golden beards and hair, and blue or green eyes. These mysterious god-men were said to have come from over the sea, bearing with them secret knowledge from the land of the gods, a highly advanced pagan civilization that worshipped the sun until it was destroyed in a great flood. Each of the civilizations that the plumed serpents allegedly founded in the Americas, namely the Maya, Aztec, and Inca, were indeed in possession of peculiar knowledge they could not have attained on their own, such as incredibly accurate cosmological models and projections, impossible for human beings of the time to ascertain. And each of these civilizations was based on a complex and bloody system of paganism revolving around the worship of the sun. Could it be that Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and Amaru were survivors of an antediluvian race whose land was destroyed in the great flood of Noah? Could it be that these mysterious plumed serpent deities were in fact exiles from the lost city of Atlantis? This notion might at first glance appear to be biblically unsound, since in the 7th chapter of Genesis, God himself declares to Noah, "I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made." However, if we analyze these words carefully, we can infer from them the scope of annihilation designated in the Great Flood. First, we can determine that the flood was localized to the face of the earth. Second, we can determine that the purpose of the flood was to destroy all living things that God had made. But what about entities that might not have even been on the earth at the time of the flood? Living things that God had not made. Is such a thing even conceivable? In order to determine the plausibility of this scenario, two questions must follow. 1. Was there technology in existence before the flood that could have enabled anyone or anything to escape? 2. Were there living things in existence before the flood that God had not made? I believe the answer to these questions are biblically self-evident in the 6th chapter of Genesis, wherein a race of hybrid giants was created through illicit sexual intercourse between angels and human females. In the apocryphal Book of Giants, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learn that these fallen angels, or watchers as they are called, not only procreated with women to produce hybrid giants, but also with hundreds of other animal species to produce a diverse host of hybrid monsters. These angel-human and angel-animal hybrids would have inherited some of the superhuman capabilities of their angelic fathers, such as superior strength and intellect, as well as extrasensory faculties. In addition to genetically inherited capabilities, the preeminent offspring of the angels, namely the giants, were taught forbidden secrets by their fathers, secrets concerning sorcery, astrology, astronomy, pharmacy, cosmetology, metallurgy, meteorology, and geology. At first, these sciences might have been employed to produce primitive implements for industry and war. But considering that the fallen angels descended to the earth in the days of Jared, according to the book of Enoch, and that from Jared to the flood of Noah more than 1,000 years transpired, as reckoned in the Septuagint, plenty of time was afforded the antediluvian hybrids to develop advanced technologies, even far surpassing those of our 21st century. Keep in mind that before the Industrial Revolution, the world was still primitive, technologically speaking. Within 100 years, mankind went from riding in horse-drawn carriages on the cobblestone streets of antiquated cities to traversing the surface of the moon in dune buggies and building space stations in orbit around the Earth. It is essential to understand that the hybrid offspring of fallen angels were unsanctioned and illegitimate life forms. In other words, they were living things not made by God. It is my hypothesis that the hybrids of the pre-flood world, under direct tutelage of their angelic fathers, had indeed developed a level of technology that could have enabled some of them to escape the great flood of Noah. Perhaps the best evidence of this stupendous claim is to be found in the timeless legend of Atlantis. The legend of Atlantis was not invented by Walt Disney. The story of the rise and fall of both the city of Atlantis and the great Atlantean Empire has been passed down in one form or another through the oral traditions of many diverse cultures all over the globe. Though the names and details may differ from one people group to another, the common thread of a technologically advanced antediluvian civilization that was destroyed in a great flood can be traced through nearly all of them. The most famous and detailed account of the fabled Atlantis comes down to us from the 4th century BC in the form of Plato's unfinished work, Critias. In the Critias, Plato recounts a dialogue between Solon of Athens and an old Egyptian priest of the goddess Neith, Athena to the Greeks, in the district of Sais. The tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made themselves temples and sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of male children, dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions. He gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and gave them rule over many men and a large territory. And he named them all. The eldest, who was king, he named Atlas, and from him the whole island and the ocean received the name of Atlantic. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was ruled by 10 kings, whose father was a god, but whose mother was human. What Plato does not reveal is that these 10 hybrid kings of Atlantis were giants. The Egyptians were not the only civilization to keep a written record of Atlantis. The mystery schools of the Far East have long concealed a secret knowledge of the once great empire that existed in the old world before the flood. In her voluminous work, The Secret Doctrine, Theosophist Helena Blavatsky translates the following stanza from an ancient Tibetan manuscript called the Book of Dizion. They, the Atlanteans, built great images 9 yatis high or 27 feet, the size of their bodies. What we have in the story of Atlantis is at the very least an allegory of the antediluvian world order, the old world order, in which the fallen angels distributed the whole earth into portions among themselves, and became each the god of his own realm, appointing his giant hybrid sons as divine kings. The allegorical nature of the story of Atlantis can be further discerned in the following remarks by late Masonic philosopher Manly P. Hall. The Critias first describes the blessed state of the Atlantean people under the benevolent rulership of 10 kings who were bound together in a league. These kings were monarchs over 7 islands. 10 kings bound together in a league is the subject of biblical prophecy concerning a final world empire that will arise before the end of the age. 7 and 10 are both numbers signifying the domain and authority of the dragon and his beast in the book of Revelation. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great, fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. Geographically speaking, the earth is divided into 7 divisions of land, or continents. The 7 islands of the Atlantean Empire serve as a symbolic representation of the 7 continents of the earth, and therefore of world dominion. Atlantis epitomizes the old world order, in which the gods mingled themselves with the seed of men, and generated hybrid offspring to rule the earth. What is most intriguing is that the coming New World Order, like Atlantis, may in fact also be ruled by 10 hybrid kings. This Atlantean scheme seems to be predicted in the 2nd chapter of Daniel, in which King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a great statue, the head of which was made of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the midsection of bronze, the legs of iron, and the feet of iron mixed with clay. The statue's compartmentalized sections, cast in distinctive metals, signify 5 world empires that would arise before the end of the age. The last of these empires, depicted in the feet of the statue, has 10 toes, which, like the 10 horns of the dragon and the beast, represent 10 kings that will rule the earth at the end of the age. But these are not 10 ordinary human kings. The feet and the toes of the statue are made of iron mixed with potter's clay. Potter's clay is often used as a metaphor for the human race, since, in contrast with heavenly beings, man was formed in the hands of God from the substance of the earth, just as a potter forms his clay. But now, O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are potter, and all we are the work of your hand. The analogy of iron mixed with potter's clay in the feet and toes of Nebuchadnezzar's statue is twofold. First, it represents a fractured kingdom. And whereas you saw the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. But the iron mixed with clay analogy does not stop there. It continues. And whereas you saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The second meaning of iron mixed with clay, in the context of Nebuchadnezzar's prophetic dream, is that the 10 kings of the final world empire, as prefigured in the 10 kings of Atlantis, will be hybrids of some kind. And the same can almost certainly be said of the citizens of their kingdom, since not just the toes, but all of the feet are comprised of iron mixed with potter's clay. Perhaps the mark of the beast, which will be compulsory for the citizens of his empire, will have more to do with genetics than microchips, more to do with bearing the genetic markers of his image within one's genome than merely bearing an external mark on the right hand or forehead. It is my opinion that Atlantis is an emblematic depiction of the antediluvian Old World Order and a prophetic harbinger of the coming New World Order, which will reinstitute the Golden Age when the gods mingled themselves with the seed of men and hybrids walked the earth. But it is also my opinion that apart from being symbolic, Atlantis was also an actual city and empire, as further detailed in Plato's Critias. According to ancient lore, Atlantis was but one of many contemporary civilizations existent in the antediluvian world, all of which ultimately annihilated one another with advanced weapons of war, in what can only be described as the ancient equivalency of the doctrine of mutual assured destruction during the Cold War. In truth, the civilizations of hybrids that existed at the end of the pre-flood age, the days of Noah, were far more technologically advanced than we could ever imagine. In fact, to some degree, what we have fancied as visions of the future in our movies and television shows, such as Star Wars and Star Trek, could perhaps be more accurately considered visions of the distant past. The theme of advanced technology in the antediluvian world is a vast and voluminous subject with many proofs, which I will not even begin to explore in this analysis. But there is one form of ancient technology that we need to consider within the context of our current narrative: vimanas. In short, the word vimana refers to the flying machines of ancient India, but it is also used as a general designation for all flying craft of the antediluvian world. There are many accounts of ancient flying machines throughout history, but none as detailed as the records preserved in the Sanskrit writings of ancient India describing vimanas. In an article entitled Flight Path, which appeared in the Times of India on the 8th of April 1999, journalist Mukul Sharma wrote the following: according to some interpretations of surviving texts, India's future, it seems, happened way back in its past. Take the case of the Yantra Sarvasva, said to have been written by the sage Maharshi Bhardwaj. This consists of as many as 40 sections, of which one, the Vaimanika Prakarana, dealing with aeronautics, has 8 chapters, 100 topics, and 500 sutras. In it, Bhardwaj describes vimana, or aerial craft, as being of 3 classes. 1, those that travel from place to place. 2, those that travel from one country to another. And 3, those that travel between planets. Of special concern among these were the military planes whose functions were delineated in some very considerable detail, and which read today like something clean out of science fiction. For instance, they had to be impregnable, unbreakable, non-combustible, and indestructible, capable of coming to a dead stop in the twinkling of an eye, invisible to enemies, capable of listening to the conversations and sounds in hostile planes, technically proficient to see and record things, persons, incidents, and situations going on inside enemy planes. Know at every stage the direction of movement of other aircraft in the vicinity. Capable of rendering the enemy crew into a state of suspended animation, intellectual torpor, or complete loss of consciousness. Capable of destruction, manned by pilots and co-travelers who could adapt in accordance with the climate in which they moved. Temperature regulated inside. Constructed of very light and heat-absorbing metals. Provided with mechanisms that could enlarge or reduce images and enhance or diminish sounds. The ancient Indian records of vimana flying craft were not just wild concoctions of the imagination, like the folklore of American tall tales, but dealt with advanced scientific concepts such as electromagnetism, gravity, and mercury vortex propulsion. Author David Hatcher Childress elucidates. The ancient Indians themselves wrote entire flight manuals on the care and control of various types of vimanas. The Samara Sutradhara is a scientific treatise dealing with every possible facet of air travel in a vimana. There are 230 stanzas dealing with construction, takeoff, cruising for thousands of miles, normal and forced landings, and even possible collisions with birds. Traditional historians and archaeologists simply ignore such writings as the imaginative ramblings of a bunch of stoned ancient writers, After all, where are these Vimanas that they write about? Perhaps they are seen every day around the world and called UFOs. Indeed, the descriptions of Vimanas in the Sanskrit texts of ancient India are very similar to the anomalous flying saucers and cigar-shaped craft that people have been reporting for decades. According to ancient lore, both the Rama and Atlantean empires of the antediluvian world were equipped with Vimana aircraft and employed them in a great war with nuclear bomb-type weaponry that wrought terrible destruction. Before you take the position that the notion of such advanced flying craft and weaponry existing in the ancient world is poppycock and unbiblical, consider the words of King Solomon. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. As previously stated, it is my hypothesis that some of the hybrid creatures from the advanced civilizations that existed in the antediluvian world were in fact able to escape the flood of Noah by means of technology, such as Vimana aerial craft. My hypothesis affords the possibility that some of these hybrids may not even have been on the planet while the earth was covered in the deluge, and would not have had anything to return to after the waters subsided, thus making them exiles, so to speak. The old world order of the antediluvian age was demolished in the wrath of God. The giants were enticed to war against one another until their whole race was annihilated. After being forced to witness the total destruction of their beloved children, the fallen watchers, who had genetically corrupted all flesh on the earth, were bound with chains and cast into the darkness of Tartarus. But before God wiped the genetic slate of the earth clean, by destroying all living things that he had made, a seed bank of pure animal stock was preserved to reseed the earth after the flood, as well as a seed bank of pure human stock in Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives. And yet, somehow, hybrid giants re-emerge on the stage of the post-flood world, though of a lesser caliber than their predecessors. Perhaps a hybrid breeding program was initiated, similar to the phenomenon of alien abductions and artificial insemination occurring in our own times. I posit that after the flood, Lucifer adopted the exiled hybrid races as agents of his own designs, emissaries of deception, and ministers of the Luciferian doctrine. These agents are perhaps best recognized in the plumed serpent godmen that taught the natives of the Americas to worship the light of Lucifer, and bequeathed them with forbidden knowledge from the antediluvian world, secrets from Atlantis. Indeed, the esoteric mystery schools have dubbed these agents of enlightenment with the fitting titles of sons of the dragon and serpents. Whether or not my hypothesis concerning these exiles from Atlantis is true, what is incontrovertibly true is that the occult orders and secret societies have long been laboring toward one universal plan: to build a new Atlantis and pave the way for the coming of the man of sin, who will resurrect a new world order like a phoenix from the ashes of the old world order, and usher in the return of the gods to commingle with men in the new golden age.
Is Mr. Alberino correct with this theory? I do not know. We simply present this theory as food for thought, but not biblical fact. In our next podcast, we'll be examining the bullet points that mark the age of Noah and how we're seeing them today. I hope you'll tune in for those, because as you see, this is a fascinating topic, which truly does prove the saying that fact is stranger and more intriguing than fiction. So, Kevin, we've covered some interesting information in this podcast. What do you think about it?
Yeah, a lot of very good information, and what I found the most interesting was Atlantis. Watching the History Channel and Discovery Channel, I always thought Atlantis was somewhere out in the middle of the Atlantic or in the Mediterranean, but it's clear as day where that is and how it relates to the text of the Bible. So
yeah, the antediluvian world was
it's quite sophisticated.
We've really covered here. Yeah, it was a world every bit as populated as this, far more advanced than we are. And of course, you're not going to really hear about this and get this kind of information anywhere, outside the Bible and, some brave archaeologists that kind of go out there and point to the fact that, hey, there's gaps in our knowledge here,
Right, exactly. I think it'll make people think. I know it made me think. And so let us know what you think. We'll wrap it up. And thank you again for joining us for this podcast. Please share it with your friends, family, congregation, and be sure to bookmark our Are We Living in the Last Days website and follow and subscribe to us on rumble.com and parlor.com. Just go to those sites and search for our name. And please stay tuned for our next podcast in the Days of Noah series. That you won't believe that one either. As always, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Just email us at ministry@arewelivinginthelastdays.com. Thank you and God bless.